Leah Hart is our land protection specialist up here in the North Country, and she's responsible. That means working with landowners to conserve lands for future generations. So she has a great job, and it's a big responsibility. Leah is a New Hampshire native, and she brings with her a love for the state's landscapes and its communities, as well as many years of experience as an easement stewardship. So we knew Leah before she was a land protection specialist. And then she moved and got some more experience at the Lakes Region Lands Trust. And now we're lucky enough to have her back with the Forest Society. And I didn't know this, but Leah said she can be found skiing, running, and gardening. I did know, however, that she's planning and building a home in Lancaster with her husband. So,
oh, nice.
Good luck with that. I know my wife and I are in the middle of a renovation, and it's a good test for anybody to do a renovation or build a house together.
Yeah.
And then John Plummer is here as well, and we were lucky enough to have him up for our snowshoeing program. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, John. And John is the easement stewardship, as I said. He's looking after properties in the North Country, as well as in the Lakes region. Before joining the Forest Society, John served in the AmeriCorps at the conservation nonprofits across New England. And he's managed volunteer trail projects on the Long Trail in Vermont and water quality projects in the Squam Lakes region. John was inspired to work in conservation during his 2017 hike of the Appalachian Trail, which he completed after leaving a job in the corporate world. So welcome to the non-corporate world, John. When not at work, John also is skiing and running in the White Mountains with his partner, Sophie, who we met on the snowshoe tour, which is great. My name's Nigel Manley. A lot of you have met me. I'm the director at the Rocks in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, and I might be found skiing, but definitely not running. Okay, Leah, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Curious About Land Conservation. Tonight, we'll talk about how the Forest Society works with landowners to protect special places across New Hampshire, or how landowners work with the Forest Society, whichever one you want to say. So happy you all could join us. Just a little bit about the format here. I'll be talking a lot at you and sharing information and sharing photos and sharing this story map behind us here that we're all looking at. Throughout the presentation, I'd love for you to ask questions, and those questions can go in the chat. So you can feel free to stay muted, and if you have a question, just go ahead and type it at any point. Nancy will be monitoring those questions and getting them to me at some point throughout the presentation. Let's see. So I'd expect that handful of folks here maybe have different backgrounds. This presentation is sort of like basics in land conservation. We'll see how far we could get. I think I could probably talk about this for like days, perhaps. So I'm happy to field your questions and kind of narrow the focus if you want to take it somewhere. But we'll get through a lot tonight. And yeah, I'd imagine that maybe you're a landowner, somebody who owns land and might be interested in protecting it. I see some conservation commissions in there from Ackworth, it seems like, and Cornish, very cool, a very different part of the state. And I'm glad that you're here, because if we had this series in person in Bethlehem, you may not have made the trip all the way up. So very happy to have you. And then maybe you're just somebody in the audience who's curious about how land conservation works. And this facet of what the Forest Society does, because we do so much. So jumping right into that, a little bit of an intro here to the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, founded in 1901 as a group of concerned citizens were witnessing the loss of forest cover and the detrimental impacts downstream due to logging from timber barons at the end of the 1800s. So at this point, the White Mountains weren't even the White Mountains, but would soon be protected with by the Forest Society's help and the help of some other conservation organizations. So fast forward 120 some odd years later, the Forest Society is now one of the country's most effective statewide land conservation organizations. I think we were actually the third land trust to be founded in the United States. Fun fact. Our mission statement was developed a little bit later than our founding in 1904. We declared we are a forestry association seeking to perpetuate the forests of New Hampshire through their wise use and their complete reservation in places of special scenic beauty. So as a nonprofit membership organization with 10,000 members, the Forest Society is dedicated to protecting the state's most important landscapes while promoting their wise use of its renewable natural resources. Some of our accomplishments to date include helping protect over 1 million acres of open space in the state with many of our partners, effectively promoting good land stewardship through education and by example, and advocating public policies that encourage the wise conservation of natural resources. So lots of info coming for you tonight. Don't worry if we don't cover it all. I'd like to introduce everybody to this resource in case you haven't already seen it. Conserving Your Land, put together by the New Hampshire Land Trust Coalition, and that can be found on their website as an electronic version. And if you email us afterwards, I can also mail you a paper version. So this was something that was developed with multiple land trusts, excuse me, and explains the land conservation process pretty well. And even if you're somebody who doesn't really know anything, or you feel like you know a lot, I think there is information in here that suits everybody and gives a great overview. So if you have other questions after this presentation, again, I'm happy to answer them, but this is also a really good resource. So what you won't get in that book, but what you will get tonight is a little bit more information regarding the Forest Society's goals and objectives and the way that we work. You'll also have the opportunity to ask questions. You can also stay completely silent and anonymous. I'm 100% fine with that. But if you have a burning question that you'd like to bring up with the group, we're happy to answer that. And I guess the last thing you will get tonight here that you won't get reading Conserving Your Land is less reading. Maybe you're somebody who learns by listening. So welcome. All right. So why conserve land? For many reasons. As discussed before, part of our founding mission at the Forest Society, and one that we continue today. Right now, the Forest Society has about 20 projects that have been approved by our board that we're actively working on across the entire state. So that brings us to Rochester, that brings us to Shelburne, that brings us to Deering, maybe even some towns that you've never heard the name of. That's why I like working for the Forest Society, because sometimes I hear towns that I'm not exactly sure where they are, and it gives me an opportunity to look them up. So the Forest Society to date owns 190 properties over 58,000 acres, and also protects land with conservation easements. These conservation easements span 135,000 acres and are over 750 properties. This map is fairly basic here. But the blue shows where our conservation easements are, and the green shows where properties that we own outright and manage. One of our largest conservation easements, 11,000 acres down here in Dora. And this is where the rocks are, up in Bethlehem, in this area in the bright green. And you can see that we also hold a handful of conservation easements and work with private landowners to manage and steward their land forever. We'll get into what a conservation easement is, so you don't have to ask that question. So, and we there are over, throughout New Hampshire, there are about 30 different land trusts or other conservation organizations that folks may choose to work with to protect their land. Each land trust has different criteria for selecting conservation projects. And so the Forest Society's criteria. All right, I have a competing person here.
I got it, Leah.
Thank you.
Was anyone not seeing Leah's screen? Is everyone seeing it?
It seems like, Tina, you might not be seeing it.
No, I'm seeing it. I have someone that emailed me, messaged me saying that they weren't seeing it.
I'm seeing it.
I just wanted to make sure everyone else was.
Yeah, I guess if anybody else is not seeing the screen and you can find the chat, feel free to put your concern in there too, and we can try to find you the screen.
You may have to try logging out and coming back in.
So as part of the Forest Society's criteria and in choosing and pursuing land conservation projects, our primary goal is to work throughout the state of New Hampshire to conserve lands which contribute to interconnected, biologically diverse ecosystems that also combat climate change, protect water quality, provide forest products, and enhance outdoor recreational opportunities. We also look quite often to enhance or enlarge properties that we already own, or even maybe have conservation easements on for a variety of purposes, whether that's access or increasing connected lands for wildlife purposes. We also work with other conservation partners and organizations. So up here in Bethlehem, Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust, who I think there might be somebody from there on our talk right now. We also shares this region of the state and protects land in this area in Bethlehem. We work with other conservation organizations to maintain and use regional plans to direct our land conservation focus. So one of those plans is called the Quabbin to Cardigan plan, stretching from the Quabbin Reservoir all the way to Cardigan Mountain in New Hampshire. Also the Merrimack Conservation Plan, plans in the Seacoast and the Lakes region. We look at data from New Hampshire Fish and Game to identify wildlife with significance. And then also the Nature Conservancy has data that allows us to focus our attention to lands that are resilient to climate change. So we protect land that's ecologically significant and are helped by partnerships and mapping programs, and then obviously just getting out on the ground and understanding the communities in which we work. All right. Oh, yes, we can't do it alone. We work with a lot of different folks to make land conservation a reality, even when we don't necessarily continue to own the land. So here's what we'll learn tonight. We'll talk about steps towards permanent land conservation, some conservation methods, what happens after we do the transactional part, the stewardship, which is, the rest of it until forever. And then we'll touch a little bit on tax benefits as well. So if you're a landowner in the audience and you're thinking about whether or not you want to protect your land, ask yourself some of the following questions. What do you love about your land? How do you envision using your land 10, 50 years from now? Does your family want to continue owning the land, maybe once you're gone? And then what are your financial needs, expectations, or objectives? That determines maybe your path forward. And then just to touch basically on steps towards permanent conservation, what does that look like? In general, land conservation is a conservation transaction. So what we're talking about when we talk about land conservation is how we protect land, and that happens through a transaction not unlike another real estate transaction. Conservation transactions needed to protect land is similar because it has the same concepts, same terminology, same paperwork, except a land trust, doing our work well and completing the transactions really well is important to us because we have to own and steward the land from now until the future. So we make sure we do a good job for a variety of reasons, including forever managing the land and upholding our obligation to protect the natural resources on each of the properties that we protect. The one difference between a conservation transaction and another real estate transaction, especially in this hot market here, is the timing. It generally takes a little bit longer for us to get our committee and board on board to raise money and to complete the transaction. It's not a closing within 45 days, but we do have to raise the money and get the manpower and the woman power to complete the work. All right. I'm taking a breath. If anybody has any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat. If not, we'll jump right down to land conservation methods.
There are no questions in the chat at this point.
Everybody knows it all. I like that. All right. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate you laughing. So we'll talk about two land conservation methods tonight, which are generally the most, the methods that we use most frequently. And that is conveying land or conserving land or receiving land if you're the Forest Society in fee simple. That means owning it outright. That means the Rocks estate. We own and we manage that land. We maintain a forest management plan and we own the complete rights to that land. Number two is conveying a conservation easement or a partial interest. And that takes a little bit more of an explanation. So I'll wait till I get there. All right, so bear with me here. So land either comes to the Forest Society through donation or selling land. And I keep referencing the Forest Society. This is true of a lot of land trusts, but because I work for the Forest Society and we're focused on what we do, I'll keep using the word Forest Society. And what fee means, again, or fee simple, is that complete ownership of the land. And if a landowner wants to protect their land, but no longer wishes to own it, this is a really good option. Let's say that somebody is, you know, done mowing their fields, they can't get around as well, they're moving into a smaller home. There's no children that are interested in living on the property, but they want to see their field and they want to see their forest protected forever. Perhaps they'd consider donating or selling land to the Forest Society to own long-term, to manage at a high standard with best management practices. And for the lands that we own, our goals and objectives are related to the key resource areas of timber, wildlife habitat, water quality, natural communities, and unique natural and cultural features, and additionally, recreation. With a few exceptions, all of our reservations are open, and we call them reservations. That is our term for lands that we own. All of our reservations are open to the public for fishing, hunting, hiking, and other passive pedestrian recreation. And regardless of what the property is, we're committed to responsible and sustainable forest management. If that is part of the management plan, is managing the forests. We have, I think, over 150 land stewards and volunteers who help manage the lands that we own. And in the land conservation process, as part of understanding the property and deciding whether or not the property meets the criteria for the Forest Society to pursue protecting this land, we'll look at the natural resources and start to understand what we'd envision doing with this property, be it managing for timber, keeping it open for recreation, maybe a little bit of both. There are some Forest Society properties that have pretty low management, not a lot at all. So advantages to the landowner in conveying full fee ownership. We'll continue to manage the land well and Landowners sometimes feel like they can leave this lasting legacy and know that the land is in good hands, while also just having more spare time to like go on vacation and stuff. You don't have to worry about mowing your field. If a landowner donates a property, one of the main reasons why somebody would donate a property is because of the tax incentives. And the tax incentives really here that we're talking about in general and most widely utilized are the federal income tax deduction. So within the year that you donate your property or donate a portion of the property, a portion of the value, you'd be able to receive a tax deduction for 30% of your adjusted gross income, and that can be carried over for 5 years. The Conserving Your Land book gives like really good real life examples of this. So if that's a motivating factor for you, or if you're on part of another land trust or another organization who wants to know more of this, look at the book too. It helps give you some more details. We could spend hours on tax incentives here, so I will skim over fairly quickly. I see a question, so I'm taking a breath here.
So the question is, I think it's from Greg. Will these materials be shared after this call? Lots of great information already. I'm currently working with 3 private owners and possible conservation easements.
Well, good for you. Awesome. Yeah, so what we'll share after is we can share, actually, maybe I should ask Tina. Tina, can we share with them a link to this booklet? And I will give it to Tina to share with everybody.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe on our website already. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I think it is already on our website. But if we're following up with folks anyways, we can try to get that directly to you all.
Yeah, I can email it. If it's on our website, the actual link.
Great. Yep. Our conservation method number 2, which is a conservation easement. Sometimes this works best when a landowner wants to protect their land permanently, but still wants to retain ownership and control, and maybe even generate some revenue from doing a sustainable timber operation. Conservation easements have people start scratching their head when we talk about a conservation easement. They're kind of challenging to understand. The definition, or one of the definitions, is a permanent legally binding agreement between a landowner and a land trust that restricts the use of land to protect its significant natural features. Okay, that's not that helpful. That's just a lot of words. So really how does a conservation easement work? By conveying a conservation easement to a land trust, a landowner voluntarily agrees to give up some of its many rights they hold as a landowner. The analogy that typically is given is a bundle of sticks, and each one of those sticks has a right associated with it. So as a landowner, you have many rights to your land, maybe your right to subdivide, or right to have a commercial restaurant, depending on town zoning, the right to construct a house. And so when you convey a conservation easement to a land trust, some of those rights or bundles of sticks or pencils I just grabbed from my drawer are given to the land trust, and the land trust, the Forest Society, promises not to exercise those rights. And by not exercising the right to subdivide, and by not exercising the right to put in a Burger King, and by not exercising the right to put in a gravel pit, the natural resources on the property stay protected forever. And the forever part is important. Conservation easements are perpetual. Activities that are generally prohibited by a conservation easement are, again, commercial, residential, or industrial. Commercial activities such as forestry and agriculture are allowed under certain other caveats. Conservation easements typically restrict subdivision or separate conveyance. Any kind of structures that aren't related to agriculture, forestry, or outdoor recreation. Conservation easements also restrict earth moving, dumping, etc. So the goal of a conservation easement is to protect the natural resources that are found on that property. And the land trust role as the holder of the conservation easement is to permanently hold the responsibility and the legal obligation to ensure that the easement terms are upheld forever. So conservation easements, true or false? You don't have to answer, just mentally put a note by these. Once a landowner places a conservation easement on their land, they continue to own their land and manage it in accordance with the restrictions. So once a conservation easement is in place, the landowner still continues to own the land. True or false? Landowners with a property protected by a conservation easement can transfer their land to a new owner at any time for any price. Conservation easements stay with the land forever, restricting uses and activities for all future landowners. Finally, conservation easements do not automatically give the public right to enter the property, although some conservation easements can guarantee this right. So if you answered true to all of these, 100%, and if you didn't, don't worry. Those are some common misconceptions with conservation easements. It's important to mention that all conservation easements are a little bit different. Generally, a land trust starts out with a conservation easement is a legal document that the land trust and the landowner will sign and agree to the restrictions that are written within that. And generally, a land trust will start with a template, a document template that has been approved by their attorney, that has been looked at by their staff, that is the flavor of the conservation easement that they are, or the flavor of the organization, and in general, they're somewhat similar, but you could have a conservation easement that is a forever wild conservation easement, prohibiting a lot of other uses than a conservation easement on farmland. As you could tell, there's this balance between protecting natural resources, but also allowing for the flexibility of a landowner to continue using the land for things such as forestry, agriculture, and recreation. Oh, yes, Greg, I see that. Yeah, I think, yes, you're right. I think maple sugaring too. Yes, the link on the website is broken. And yes, you can continue to maple sugar on your property if you have a conservation easement in many cases, and in fact, sell that maple syrup as well. Advantages to landowners, conservation easements. A peace of mind that the natural resources on the property are permanently protected while you can continue owning the land. And that's really big. Maybe the way you work on the land doesn't change at all once you decide to donate or sell a conservation easement. As with donating land, if you were to donate an easement or donate a portion of the value, the big tax incentive there is, again, a federal income tax deduction. And for a conservation easement, you can claim up to 50% of your adjusted gross income over 15 years. So a little bit different, again, a little bit more information about tax incentives and other more in-depth explanations in the Conserving Your Land book. Let's see. Conservation easements. Let's see, what else did I forget? We'll continue talking about them in other places, but sometimes a confusing topic for some. I assume maybe because you all are here, you maybe have heard about a conservation easement before and have different levels of understanding. So if you have any questions as we go on here, feel free to answer, or feel free to ask. And then if you want to answer too, good, especially if it's a hard question. All right, timing of conveyance. Generally, when landowners are calling us up there and asking whether or not we want to work with them to conserve their land, they're generally talking about immediate conveyance. Like, how quickly can I do this? Can I do this within the tax year so I can get a deduction? Can I sell you my farmland so I can pass it on to the next generation for a little bit less cost because we've essentially sold the development rights? But there's also, excuse me, There's also times where a landowner will decide to convey property in stages. Maybe they own a lot of land. Maybe their objectives are just different. And then some folks look to donate their land in their will or by devise. So if you're thinking, or if you have folks, you work with folks who are thinking about doing this, we'd encourage anybody who's interested to talk to a land trust first, and for a land trust or another organization to talk to the person who is looking to donate, to make sure it's still a good fit, because nobody really plans to die, and that sometimes that land comes in and you're having to make a decision about whether or not you can continue to manage it. And having that expectation up front is I think helpful for the land trust and for the person who was so generous to think about giving it after they have passed. And then, do you remember this season? I don't, it seems very far away. All right, so let's say that the Forest Society has evaluated the natural resources on the property. We've had a conversation with a landowner. We know that they're looking to conserve the land, and we know we want to work with them to conserve this property. What do these steps look like? And again, this kind of goes back to, just these transactional steps that are not necessarily super unique to land conservation, but the kind of nitty gritty of like what goes on behind the scenes. So at some point, generally an appraisal will be obtained. And if an appraisal is obtained at the beginning, it's generally because you are looking to sell your property, or the land trust is looking to buy your property, or a conservation easement. What an appraisal does is it tells you how much the fair market value is for the property, and it allows you to establish a price at which the land trust will pay to buy the land or the easement, and the landowner will sell land or easement. Generally so if you're donating property or a landowner is donating property, an appraisal may be obtained for income tax deduction purposes, and that would happen later in the process. It's not necessarily important to know the value of the land or easement at the beginning, but more closer to the time of closing, when the landowner may be seeking an income tax deduction. So it's a little bit confusing with appraisals and when you use them, how. And when we talk in general about all projects, easement, not easement fee, purchase versus donated, it can get a little bit confusing, but at least I'll throw out some terms, and if some of them stick, then you can look them up later. So once the appraisal is done and the Forest Society is able to establish the fair market value and come up with an agreement with the landowner on a price, we then go to our Land Protection Committee and board to get full approval for that. So it's not Leah's Land Trust. Again, it's the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, and as a nonprofit and a 501c3, we have certain processes to follow. We'd then be able to sign a purchase and sales agreement if the Land Protection Committee and board agreed that this was a valuable project for us to pursue. And that purchase and sales agreement establishes expectation and determines the sale price, transaction details, and other key terms of contract. So once we sign the purchase and sales agreement, if you're a landowner, you don't really necessarily see all these behind the scenes things. As a land trust and in my work, what I'm doing behind the scenes is shepherding this project through, working through this transaction, and keeping the landowner informed. But a lot of this work happens, behind a desk. It's actually not that exciting. I have the least exciting pictures here, but it is the work that gets the land protected. So it's really important. So the first thing we'll do, or one of the first things we'll do, is title research, which is, reviewing the ownership records or the title of the property. And these are steps we'll do for every single transaction. So like another example of, you could go ahead and buy a property yourself, but you don't necessarily have to do title research. You could just buy it and hope that you had complete title. Forest Society doesn't want to do that. Land Trust we can't do that. We're, as an accredited organization, and I'll get into that later, we have certain steps that we must follow. Another one of those is an environmental assessment. And this is somewhat confusing. Environmental assessment sounds like maybe a natural resource inventory, but in this case, we're not necessarily looking for the rare toad. We are looking for the rare junk cabin in the corner of the property that we didn't know about and has an oil drum there. So an environmental assessment evaluates if there's any kind of hazardous or solid waste on the property that we need to be aware of and address either before closing or decide not to work on the property due to the contamination issues. Additionally, we'll work on a survey for the property. It's a good thing to have when you're trying to manage the property or make sure that the easement terms are upheld, to know exactly where that property is. And then fundraising. Even with donated projects, we still have to do a little bit of fundraising. So for the projects where we buy land or easement outright, of course we have to fundraise, right? We're paying a landowner to buy their property or their easement. But again, we still have to raise money to cover some of our transaction costs, to cover our stewardship costs. And those are stewardship costs that happen upfront soon after we purchase the property or the property is donated to us. And then longer term stewardship costs. So putting money into an endowment to make sure that we can steward our properties over the long term. And so fundraising will happen in maybe many ways, applying for grants such as LCHIP or other smaller regional grants, working with conservation commissions to see if they would like to contribute money from their conservation fund. And then maybe even doing a private mailing out to landowners in the community looking to raise money. So while we're doing that, we're also reviewing legal documents and preparing those documents. With a conservation easement, that sometimes can be 40 pages of information about what a landowner and the land trust have agreed to as the restrictions and how they're going to protect those natural resources. The Forest Society does all that. Afterwards, the transaction will move towards closing, again, like you would close on a house or anything, signing the documents here. And then after if you're a landowner, you've donated your land or you've sold your land or you've donated an easement or sold a conservation easement, or if you're a conservation commission, you've accepted those. After that comes the meat of it, and it's stewardship. I should also mention, I skipped one. If there is any donative component, it may be applicable to for some landowners to pursue an income tax deduction. And at this point, they do so. Generally, you can, you'll get an appraisal, a landowner will get an appraisal at this point to determine how much their contribution was worth, how much their land is worth, and how much they can deduct from their federal income taxes at the date of their gift. But let's move into stewardship. So stewardship is a forever commitment to land conservation. The land trust has a legal responsibility to ensure the land is well managed and cared for forever. This means having an effective stewardship program and a long-term commitment and financial resources. Cue John Plummer.
Thanks, Leah. So yeah, as a conservation easement steward, I'm out in the field during the warmer months, meeting with landowners and monitoring properties. For myself, working in the North Country, my region, would start over in Hanover, and then you could draw a line across in between Winnipesaukee and Squam, and I have everything north of there. So I'm driving around, meeting with landowners, making sure that the properties are being managed in accordance with the easement, helping landowners plan for any projects, forestry, agriculture that they're trying to start, and addressing any issues that might be coming up. So, yeah.
Thanks, John. John works with a handful of other staff members at the Forest Society as well, helping to monitor easements and work with landowners across the whole state. If you have any easement monitoring or easement stewardship questions, we might have John give some answers. But I see one hand raised. I'm not sure if it's about easement stewardship or something else. Greg.
Yeah, can you hear me, Leah?
I can, yep.
Yeah, back to on your discussion, the steps that you outlined, it looks like they assume that the landowner's wishes, restrictions, uses, all of that has been decided before you get into those steps. Is that
Yep.
like and then is it a lawyer? Are there attorneys involved in crafting the artifacts, the easement, the deed with those restrictions in there? Is that typically how it's done?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If we were working with if we were working with a landowner who wants to protect their property with a conservation easement, we'd start having the conversation with them at the very first meeting about what our conservation easement restrictions are and what their plans are for the land. So we start getting an idea of what the conservation easement will look like. So for example, there's some folks I'm working with who are on a pond, and they know they want to conserve the pond, the area around the pond, but they also want to be able to put in a dock, a seasonal dock. And so they said, hey, Leah, how can we do this with a conservation easement? And I'm like, oh, okay, yes, I think we can we can write into the conservation easement that this is an allowed use permitted by the reserved rights. So we start kind of figuring that out as the project develops. And then as we'll even actually share like a draft deed at the beginning of the project so that landowners start to understand it. It's like some landowners are really conservation easements are not simple, and it's a big decision to conserve your land, and it's a steep learning curve to learn about a conservation easement. So we try to help landowners like get as much information as they can in different ways. So like talking with us, reading different resources, reading a conservation easement deed, thinking about how it will play out on their property. And then when we get to the point where we're drafting an easement, we'll have staff at the Forest Society draft an easement based on a model document that has been previously approved by our attorney. So the document doesn't change too much, maybe. Maybe it changes a lot depending on the property. And then that document, if it's a conservation easement deed, even if it's just, it's a deed with no restrictions, just a warranty deed conveying land to the Forest Society, we'd have an attorney review that before we presented it to the landowner. We also encourage all landowners to have their own attorney review the deed on their behalf.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. So they can start the process with you guys, thinking of the forestry. They can start the process without an attorney, but at some point they may want to. It would be advisable for them to have their own attorney look over what you guys produce.
Yeah, exactly. And so what is on the tasks that are on the landowner's shoulders and the costs that any landowner will have to pay as part of this, regardless if I can get into costs later, but I guess advise that we can't give financial advice, we can't give legal advice, we can't give tax advice. So we advise that all landowners work with their own professionals and that they'll have to pay for that. And so that is something that we say right out in the onset. And we are always happy to work with those folks and advisors and throughout the process. And yep.
Great, thanks, Leah.
Yes, good question. So stewardship of fee-owned lands or our reservations. When the Forest Society or other land trusts own the land, we complete regular visits to the property, develop management plans. In our case, forest management plans on most of our properties, on all of our properties, excuse me. We conduct management activities, mark boundaries, post signs, install and maintain public recreational improvements, depending on the property, pay annual property taxes, liability insurance, and then provide some education opportunities to the public. and then enforce property rights and protect conservation resources on the property. And we do that for the long term. And so this is a forestry tour, it looks like, in, let's see. All right. So I mentioned this a little bit before as I was getting carried away about something, but so the Land Trust Alliance is a national accreditation entity that the Forest Society is accredited with, and many other land trusts across the state have pursued accreditation with and have gotten it. So what this means is that if a land trust is accredited, that we meet certain standards and practices through all of our work. So even from transactions to stewardship to finance to governance of the land trust, of the nonprofit, we have this, aside from our mission and other parameters that guide our work, we also are accredited by the Land Trust Alliance, which keeps the standard really high for all land trusts across the country who choose to be a part of its accreditation program. Funding stewardship of conservation land. We talked a little bit about this before, but land trusts have to plan for the future. We'll be holding land and monitoring conservation easements forever, mostly forever for all conservation easements. As part of the land project, we will end up raising money for easement stewardship, for easement projects. That cost is fixed right now. Where are we at? So we ask for $14,000 for our easement stewardship endowment plus $1,000 for a stewardship defense fund. And so that money sometimes is donated by the landowner. Sometimes we'll raise the money, and we can raise the money through various avenues. For lands that we own outright in fee, we have another calculator that generates some of the upfront costs that we need to tend to, marking boundaries, putting in a gate, and then our long-term reservation stewardship endowment to ensure that we have enough capacity to manage the land over time. All right. Tax benefits. We're not going to go too deep into this. So this kind of echoes what we were talking about, Greg. Land trusts can provide landowners with helpful information, but cannot provide legal, financial, or tax advice. So folks should consult their own advisors. The other thing with tax benefits is it can change over time and is fairly case dependent. And the only tax benefits associated with permanent land conservation are at the federal level. There are none at the state level other than municipal property taxes, and we can talk a little bit about current use. And then finally, excuse me, individual landowners must consult qualified advisors to help evaluate your options. So just echoing the first sentiment there. And we sometimes, if a landowner isn't sure who to use, we have a list of appraisers that we sometimes recommend for folks. And kind of can help landowners identify people that can help them out, because for some people this is the first time they've done this, or maybe they've lived on their land for 50 years and they've never really needed to think about this until now. So we're 10 minutes away, 7 o'clock, and we've discussed everything about land conservation. I'm just kidding. We've only touched on the surface of many different things here. And I'd be happy to answer some questions. I can always talk about more in depth of any of these topics, but I'm going to stop talking for 20 seconds and let other folks raise their hands and have a time to talk. Nancy, you're raising your hand. And
there we go. Okay, I couldn't unmute there for a while. Yes, my question is, do you know, you talk about the taxes are paid, the municipal property taxes. Does putting your land in either into an easement or an actual donation, does that change the town assessment? I mean, would it reduce what the town would get through taxes, or would it be unchanged?
Well, well, if you didn't own the property anymore, oh, so from the town's perspective, is
Municipal.
that
From the
what you-
town's perspective, yeah.
Right. So the Forest Society still, we and other land trusts pay taxes on the properties that we own. So that doesn't change. They're under current use probably to begin with anyways. So I guess I should talk a little bit about current use. Generally land that folks tend to conserve is already under current use. So there's not a huge difference in the tax savings or the tax revenue, I guess, if you're talking about from the town's perspective. So current use is for, hold on a sec, let's see, is a property tax program that provides an opportunity for owners of undeveloped land, forest, farmland, to receive a lower tax rate. And so if you have, you maybe everyone knows this already, but I'll just explain a little more. If you have 10 acres or more, you might be able to qualify for this program, 10 acres that are undeveloped. The difference between, and I guess and this really wasn't to your question, Nancy, but because I get this question a lot, I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit. The big difference between current use and conservation easements is that conservation easements are forever, are permanent. Whereas current use, you can take land out of current use. The person who does that has to pay a penalty. But you know, it is reversible. Now there are some cases where conservation easements are amended or changed, but that has to go through a very lengthy process, including getting approval by staff at the Forest Society committee, board, the Attorney General's office in New Hampshire, and it has to be looked upon favorably by the IRS. So conservation easements are permanent and can't be changed. That wasn't your question, but that's where we ended.
I can jump in there, Leah, just from Aqua's perspective. Nancy, it does lower the amount of tax revenue. It's peanuts because, as Leah said, most of it's, you know, under the current use. So it's not a lot, but it does lower it a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah. And I had a question about, Leo, is if we were going to recommend to a landowner to contact you guys, who should they be contacting? I know we have our stewards, you know, our steward that I walk properties with and we do monitoring. Is that the person, or is there someone else they should be contacting?
So if you're asking if a landowner in Ackworth wants to protect their property with the forest and explore that with the Forest Society,
Right.
they can contact me. They can, I'm trying to think of how many staff we have. We have a handful of staff members, 3 others who work on land protection projects and help administer those. And so any one of us can take those questions. They can also just email or call the Forest Society's general phone or email their general inbox, and we'll get back in touch with them. We're usually fairly quick about that. But yep, I'm a fine place to start too.
Great, thank you.
Somebody asked me a question the other day about like conservation easements versus land that owning land outright, like which one the Forest Society prefers and which one we do more often. I think it probably depends on the case, and our mission hasn't changed in 100 some odd years. Our focus kind of shifts here or there, but By and large, we're doing both conservation easement and fee-owned properties. It sort of just depends. I think, again, right now, I said we had 20 projects that we're working on actively. And I think it's about a 50-50 split, with maybe a little bit more land that we're pursuing, protecting in fee, so outright ownership. Oh, Nancy.
It's me again. This is more a comment, not a question, but can you get us back to that map that you had of all the easements and like their second slide practically?
Yeah, I hope I just didn't
There it
make
is.
your eyes go buggy.
There it
Yep.
is. My comment is, first, I am sort of surprised to see the clusters, I'm going to say below the notch or below the lakes region. There's so many there and not as many up north, which to me, it just seems there's a lot more land up north. Granted, the White Mountain National Forest is up there and there are other things, but that was sort of a surprise to me to see that
Yeah,
cluster.
yeah, absolutely. If we had put all of the conservation lands on this map that were lands that were protected by anybody, not just the Forest Society, we'd see a blob of green here. We'd
Yeah.
see a blob of green here. We'd see one here. But that's not to say that, part of the reason why there's lots of properties in certain locations is because those were part of a conservation plan. We were targeting an area for a certain period of time and doing land conservation fairly quickly. And in the North Country right now, there isn't a conservation plan that we're necessarily following with other partners. I don't think that's necessarily the only reason why we haven't done more land conservation up there. But yeah, it's the North Country, and I guess Coos County and Northern Grafton County, and then the area around the White Mountains is a place that we hope to focus on more.
And then if you could just zoom into Bethlehem a little bit again. And I know you pointed out the Rocks Estate, but I wanted, whoops. Did you do that? Yeah. I just want to point out to that little green spot right there. Thank you. And that is Bretzfelder Park. And that's who's presenting this program. Yay!
So on that note, it's
I just want to have
6:59.
you all visit us because it's a lovely little park. There's hiking trails, there's ski trails when there's snow, open sunrise to sunset, and a nice place to take picnics. And we have programs. We have these programs in the February-March time period, and then we have programs on Wednesday evenings in August, almost four Wednesdays in August, which I don't know what they are yet, but we're setting those up now. So come visit us up in Bethlehem. See our beautiful Bretzfelder Park. That's my comment.
Leah,
Thank you. Yes.
Lillian asked if the map that's being shown right now is going to be available to those that have attended, because she wanted to know if land being conserved around Franklin right now.
This map won't be made available quite yet. I can absolutely answer some questions about land that's being that is conserved around your property if you want to email me directly. Well, thank you for jumping in, Nancy, and talking a little bit about Bretzfelder. Thank you so much for hosting this and doing all that you do.
Thank you, Leah, for providing this information. It was very informative. And I know that people, if they have questions, they know that they can contact you through the Forest Society or others on your team. It's such a great job. You guys do such a good job. I appreciate it.
Right back at you. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your night. And again, yes, feel free to continue the conversation or ask other questions, but definitely stay curious.
Thank you.
Thanks,
and re-
guys. Great
Stop the
session.
recording.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you,